everyone, welcome to Dr. Lisa's Soul Senti podcast, and I am Dr. Lisa, and today we are going to go into part 2 of our series, Discovering the Root Causes. And this has stemming from a brand new season 4, which starts off with what is functional medicine, and then we jumped into a series where we're going to talk about looking at root causes. If you're not too sure what functional medicine is, definitely jump back to the podcast 2 before this one. And there's also season 1, season 2, and season 3 jam-packed with a ton of functional medicine, educational knowledge and information, and even some protocols that may be helpful for you in working with your practitioner. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to me and work with me. Just know that these podcasts aren't to treat or cure anything. They are definitely for your educational purposes to help you increase your health and knowledge. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 pillars. What we were doing in this series and in the last podcast was talking about root causes. And we talked about in the previous one, the key pillar number 1 is inflammation. To summarize that, because we're not going to talk about that here, is that inflammation is really present in diseases. So we have practitioners, and we talk about this all the time in functional medicine, that if you have an illness or you are either dying, or even if you've died of an illness, that inflammation is present. And inflammation seems to be the driving force that creates this cellular change, these cellular death, and these reasons why systems break down or organs don't function, or we get this imbalance and dysfunction in the body. So I was talking about that in the first part of this series. And I also brought up a question. I addressed, what causes inflammation? So let's get down to the root cause of what's causing inflammation. And in that podcast, I talk about those root causes, one of them being the leaky gut and the gut issues. Which brings us to the second key pillar, which is imbalances and deficiencies. What is that? So this is a really great topic, and it actually kind of feeds off the first podcast. So if you didn't listen to the first podcast in the series, which is about inflammation, please go back. And because this one's going to kind of feed off that. At the end of that podcast, I talked about looking at the gut for a lot of different health issues. So I mentioned, rheumatoid arthritis and joint pain, fibromyalgia, which is like all that muscle and nerve pain. And there's also thyroid issues of all kinds, there's different things. We talked about outside the gut. We're talking about these chronic inflammatory conditions, autoimmune. We talked about, don't know if I mentioned PCOS, but attacking ovaries, that the inflammation and this inflammatory storm can leave the gut because the gut wall isn't functioning properly, and these things can get into the bloodstream. We also talked about some kind of, invasive things or things that shouldn't leave the gut that leave the gut and can create also an autoimmune response. So we talked about like bacteria leaving the gut, food peptides leaving the gut. There's some kind of infections and cytokines themselves and histamine and all these different things. So that inflammatory story, that little tornado going on in your gut, I discussed in that podcast. But we have to also go back to the gut and discuss a little deeper this topic, and it takes us to the second pillars, which is imbalances and deficiencies. I want to talk about imbalances. I did touch upon lightly on that on the first podcast of inflammation. One thing I do look at is I go in and I look at the gut print. That's the word I made up. I love it. It's your gut print. It's looking at your gut flora, your gut microbiome. And if you don't know what those medical terms are, it's the environment inside your gut. The gut is a huge surface area, right? So it's looking at the terrain inside your gut. Specifically in our testing, we're looking at the colon, but we're looking at all the good bacterias that live in harmony with you, that you're born with, and it's living with you inside you. And people may not realize this, but these good bacteria, they have species and then they have names. And underneath the species has specific families. It gets quite confusing, and you don't need to know all that. That's the stuff that the functional medicine doctors were all trained in, and we needed to understand it. But it gets a little scary with some people and confusing, because something like the species Streptococcus lives inside your gut. Something like the species E. coli and Streptococcus and Staphylococcus, people get really nervous when they have that, even the family within the C. diff family. So a lot of these, these good bacteria, these species, they live within us, but they need to live in a harmony. And we tapped on this in the last two episodes, or, podcast episodes, is that inflammation and things going awry for a very short period of time is actually a safety thing. But when we become chronic, when imbalances occur, if they occur for a short period of time, they might be the innate intelligence of the body to fix something. But when these imbalances, they go chronic, they actually can cause you to become sick. So it's another root cause. So when we're looking at the gut, we're looking at the imbalances that might exist inside your terrain that are causing some health issues. What does that mean? Think of a garden and I know I talked about this in many of my podcasts, but you really have to envision that a garden, when you're gardening, the soil is really super important. And I had a friend teach me this, or actually I didn't really pay attention and I regret it. But he was telling me that he's my landscaper and wanted to do my, he was putting in, well, originally we put down some sod and this is at a different home that I live now, but we were putting down sod and sprinklers and in this area in the backyard, and he kept an area open, and he goes, I'm not going to do that area. I'm going to make that your garden, and I'm going to get the soil right, and it needs, this, and I heard nitrogen, pH, and blah, 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 aeration, all this stuff. And I was like, okay, I got the best garden every year that he came back and I let him do the soil. I mean, I planted the plants, but he did the soil. I got the best garden ever. Unfortunately, he passed away, and I, again, didn't really pay attention. I should have, of what he did. I should have let him teach me this. But when I tried to do it on my own, I got the worst garden ever. I hate to say it. I'm getting better at it, but the soil needs to have a harmony, a balance that works. And then as you're growing the garden, you've got to keep that balance. You've got to keep that harmony. And you can even think of your pool with the water or a fish tank. You need a balance, a symbiotic, relationship. And once these things get off, they can be off for a short period of time. But if they just become chronic, you get a sick garden, right? You get a sick fish tank. So this is really, really what I feel goes on in the body, in the gut, is that when your gut microbiome and these gut bacterias get off balance, it creates sicknesses. And what we're looking at is overgrowths and undergrowths, which creates that seesaw effect where they're not balanced. One's too high, some families are too high, and some families are too low. You might know the name SIBO. It's a big thing that goes around, and that's an intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and it gets up to the small intestine. But there's something that I've termed the large intestine bowel overgrowth. So it's like, there's SIBO, but there's LIBO, because what you're talking about is that the terrain of the gut, the good bacteria in the gut that need to live in harmony with each other, some of these families or species are overgrowing, and some of other ones are, not growing. So they're undergrowing. There's an undergrowth and an overgrowth, which creates this seesaw effect, this imbalance. We don't want an overgrowth of one family, which causes another family to suffer. And that's what causes some of the sickness in the gut. And this can also attribute to the leaky gut we talked about in, the last podcast. So that's really, really important, because An overgrowth, think of them as weeds in the garden, right? They're there. They're okay if they're, small and they're not overtaking the garden and not overtaking the other things in the garden. So that's how I look at overgrowths, as weeds in the garden, and it has to be controlled. So that's really important when we talk about imbalances. Imbalances also can occur outside the gut. It can occur other areas in the body, and these are the things that functional medicine look for. So we talked about inflammation in the last podcast, how I look at it as like a buoy in the water going, hey, we have plenty inflammatory markers that we can test today in the stool, in the blood. And so we can look, it's kind of like a compass. Like when you see an inflammatory marker in the blood or the stool, it's saying, hey, this is on fire over here. You need to look here. It's not telling you what the cause is. It's just telling you, hey, this is on fire. You need to come here and you need to find out what's causing the fire and put it out. So that's how I see these markers. I see inflammation. With imbalances, it's usually another thing. If you can see an imbalance on a lab test, that's great. In my case with the gut microbiome, we have a stool test that tests this. It's 50 something pages long. It's absolutely incredible. It's one of the most thorough tests I've seen yet out today on the market, because it tests so many microbes, and then it also tests some of the bad things that I'm gonna get into more in the next podcast, but we also test any kind of pests in the garden. We're looking for these invasive things such as parasites and bacteria and viruses and an overgrowth of yeast and things like that. So our stool test is very comprehensive, but it will give us your gut print. It'll tell me this is the patient's imbalance. Here's the overgrowths and the undergrowths. And the next wonderful thing is the test tells me this is the probiotic they need to fix this. That's how we fix it. We put a probiotic that's going to help support the growth of the under ones, the ones that are too low, which will help bring down the ones that are too high. Now, if there's a pest in there or there's another scenario going on in there, if there's food sensitivities in there, we definitely have to address those things too. However, that's a really important imbalance. If you go outside the gut, there's obviously imbalances, and I'm going to use the thyroid as a great example. If for some reason the thyroid's not working properly, if you were to run a blood test and you see markers saying, hey, TSH is really a little too high, it's not good here, or if we see some antibodies to the thyroid, or we see T4, T3 too low, we see these markers, like these buoys going, hey, yeah, you need to look over here. We have a fire going on. So you're going to have to say to yourself, all right, there's inflammation in the thyroid. There's something wrong with the thyroid, but we're going to look at what's the imbalance, what's that root cause of that thyroid problem. And so again, some of the imbalances can be the fact that the equations, so, we're going to get a little chemistry class here, but I'm going to keep it very simple. If you're going to, in order to get this T3 and this T4 that you need, you have to go through some equations where A plus B have to come together to make C. And then C is going to go, it's going to go C plus D is going to equal E. And in these stories that I'm telling you, these little equations, you need a bunch of other things. So in order for A to go to B, you're going to need some vitamins, right? You might need B2, you might need B3, you might need selenium, you might need zinc. If you have any questions about thyroid, please go back to my last season. I have a whole series on it. And I actually have a protocol that I personally use that I found to help me. So if I'm not going to get into thyroid here, but I want you to tell you that we're looking for imbalances. So if we see an imbalance in these equations of, iodine being converted or the thyroid hormone combining with the iodine, that's basically what T1, T2, and T3 and T4 is. That 3 is the 3 iodines. And so if we start seeing that these conversions, even from T4 to T3, don't work properly, these equations, A plus B equals C, then you need C to go with D to get to E. If we see a broken link anywhere along, an imbalance going on, that needs to be fixed, because that could be the root cause of why the thyroid's not working properly. Okay? You could do this with the brain, with the neurotransmitters. You can do this with the liver. You could do this with many different systems of the body where you're looking for an imbalance. It's very specific to that possible system or that organ or that gland. the crazy thing and the beautiful thing all in one, wrapped in one, is that sometimes a lot of these imbalances outside the gut come from deficiencies. And that's why I'm going into the next part of this podcast is deficiencies. Deficiencies in what? So many things can be deficient. And the thing that we can control the most in the deficiencies are your micronutrients. And I know that the world is so caught on macronutrients. And I have a podcast on this. So again, go back, and if you like my podcast, go through them. I talk about macro versus micros and how important micros are. And I talk about, there's a whole 20-minute chat on micronutrients. Micronutrients are your vitamins, your minerals, your antioxidants, your amino acids. We have a fantastic test that tests all these for you, and you'll know your levels. And what we want to always fix is the deficiencies here, because these deficiencies actually can be a root cause of diseases. They definitely can. Thyroid needs B2, B3. It needs selenium. It needs zinc. It needs vitamin C. And magnesium helps out too. So like you have any deficiencies in any of those areas, your system, right, your thyroid, your cells are going to possibly really struggle to function, to have a functioning thyroid, for those equations to happen, to make T1, T2, T3, T4, to convert T4 to T3, to get T3 into the cell. All these things that have to happen to convert iodide to iodine. These things must occur in order to have a functioning thyroid. You also have to say, you need a lot of things, but I'm just going to run, off the top of my head, copper and iron and magnesium and B6 and B12 and methionine and glutathione for a functioning brain and liver. So these are other things. If you're deficient in these things, you might be ADD, ADHD, you might have a problem focusing, you might have a problem with impulsivity, you might have a problem with memory. So there's certain, our vitamins, our micronutrients are super, super important, and their deficiencies can, and have been linked to a plethora of health problems. So again, that comes down to your diet. We said we were going to talk about that today. What you eat, you are what you eat. That whole saying that you learn when you're young is so true. If you're not eating a plant-based diet that has a ton of these vitamins in them, with some protein for sure, because there's some vitamins in the chickens and the fish and the eggs that aren't possibly in the vegetables, but you really need a plant-based diet to get that rainbow of colors and all the different vitamins. And you definitely want to do the nuts, the seeds, the plants, let's just say the vegetables, the fruits, with you can do some chicken, organic chicken, and a little bit of beef, and I'm trying to think, fish and nuts and seeds and all these beautiful things. You're staying whole foods. If I could control, I always say, if I could be, I know this would never happen. I probably shouldn't even say this, but if I could have a magic wand, that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to put it that way. If I could have a magic wand, I would get rid of the box aisles in the food stores, and I would get back to markets, which I've seen in Europe, and I love them, where you're going to get your fish and it's fresh, and you're going to get your meat and it's fresh, and you're going to get your fruits and your vegetables, and you're going to get your nuts and your seeds and your cheeses, and you're just going to go to each little market, and you're only going to have a small, tiny little aisle that's really small and short and just a couple, where you get your condiments, and maybe, you only have a choice of 4 cereals, and, and you're going to, the bread's going to be over at the bakery. It's not going to be processed and packaged and boxed and all this horrible thing that I don't call food. I really don't even go down the box aisles. I only run down one, and I park my little cart on the side. If I need a specific, I like to use coconut aminos, or if, I'm trying to think, if I run down and if say I want some almond crackers or something like that, I'd have it made or gotten from a bakery or something like that. Or you're usually cheating too, right? Your breadcrumbs should be from fresh bread, but you're going to run down and get the processed one. So you got to really think of those aisles. They're not wonderful. If I want coffee, that's down one of those aisles, right? Teas. So you really have to think about eating healthy. But I want to end this on a note that I want you to really fully understand, again, what you could take from this podcast would be where I'm going to end it here. Imbalances have to be fixed. You have to look for them, and you've got to fix that. But you always have to ask yourself, what is the root cause of the imbalance? So even with a vitamin deficiency, I know this is kind of like a ladder, where, okay, you may have found an imbalance, and then you may have found a couple vitamins that are deficient that might go with that imbalance. So say the thyroid, and you found that the person's deficient in selenium and zinc and B2 and B3, and you're like, okay, I'm going to fix that. Here's the next part. If the gut wall is not working properly, it doesn't absorb the vitamins as well as it should. So what happens in leaky gut, which again is really the root cause of the problem, right? Because now you got to ask yourself, what's causing the leaky gut? So you have to get down to as close as you can to the very root cause. And that's what this is about. So the leaky gut, let's go up another step of the ladder, right? Or take a step back. You have these B2, B3 deficiencies, and let's say selenium and zinc. And then you look at the person's diet, and okay, if it's a crappy diet, we can make changes there for sure. We're going to do that. But you also have to look at the gut, and you have to look at that gut wall, and you have to ask yourself, is it functioning properly? Does the patient's gut work the way it should? Does that gut only let the important things out, which are the vitamins? Is it allowing the B vitamins to get out? Is it allowing all the vitamin D to get out? Is it taking the micronutrients, the vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, amino acids, by the way, you need for your brain? Are they getting out into the bloodstream and going where it should? Or is the gut wall too permeable and not functioning, and it's letting out bad things that are competing now with the micronutrients? So that you've got these other things getting out, which are pushing the micronutrients back in, and you are not getting micronutrients into the bloodstream. So you could have a patient that eats really healthy, that's in really good shape, taking care of themselves, and they're like, why do I have a thyroid problem, right? Or why do I have this problem? Or why do I feel like this? They might not even know they have a thyroid problem. They might just say, why am I always tired? Why do I have bloating? Why do I look like I'm 3 months pregnant? Why? What's going on here? So the symptoms, right, are the buoys saying, hey, there's something going on. Please look here. There's a fire. There's an imbalance. There's something not right. And so what we do is like I always say, we put our scuba gear on, and then you and I dive down and we look deep. But sometimes you have to go deeper than the one thing you find. And that's kind of the different, where it's not a singularity type of practice. Our cells and our systems, they work as a whole. And that's what we're really looking at where conventional methods are very different, because they might be looking at a single problem or a single symptom and saying, oh, I just want to get rid of the symptom. So the person might have reflux, and you're just going to give them an antacid just to get rid of the reflux. But you have to ask yourself, why does the patient have reflux? What's causing the reflux? And many times, again, reflux is associated with digestive issues, leaky gut, microbiome imbalances, and definitely deficiencies of vitamins. So a lot of these things are interrelated. When you have a symptom, it might be related to a multifactorial thing. I tell people sometimes when we're talking and we're looking and when I'm going over their history and I'm going over their health symptoms, some people are chronically, excuse me, ill. And I might say to them, look, sounds like there's possibly like 8 fires going on here, and we're going to try to put out all 8, but if we can get 6 out of the 8 out, that's going to make you feel so much better. So this is like a multi-system approach. This is a holistic approach, looking at your entire body, but really focusing on the gut because it's the hugest surface area. So please learn about a leaky gut, learn about the gut wall dysfunction, learn about the immune system in the gut wall, learn about what goes on with this tornado in your gut and how it can get out of your gut and really get into the bloodstream and affect the rest of your organs and your cells. So that's imbalances and deficiencies. I hope you enjoyed that. And the next podcast, we're going to talk about toxins, because that's a whole nother topic. And I hope you enjoyed this. Again, remember, it's educational purposes for you to increase your health and wisdom. Thank you.